Chapter 7. At the place of the big portage, Gras, Ran Portage. What hidden magic there is in the name of this old trading post. It conjures up a magnificent panorama of rich and colorful history that goes so far back it becomes lost in legend. Today, Grand Portage is hardly more than a shadow of its former self, when it was the headquarters for a brisk trade in furs. Certainly, the tourist motoring along the North Shore is disappointed at what he finds if he obeys the impulse to turn off the main highway at Mineral Center and follow the gravel road that leads to Grand Portage. It is a nondescript place from which all signs of activity have long since vanished. A general store, a post office, and a few houses break the monotony of the rugged landscape. Down closer to the shoreline of Lake Superior, an attempt has been made to reconstruct the fort maintained there by the Northwest Company in the heyday of fur trading. There is a trading post where the tourist may purchase curios and souvenirs, or obtain refreshments before continuing his trip. At one corner of the stockade stands a replica of the blockhouse. The more enterprising seer may climb a narrow stairway to its second story to catch a glimpse of sprawling Isle Royale in the distance. If he is fortunate enough to obtain the keys, which are in the custody of the storekeeper, he can gain entrance to the little church, whose original walls, now covered by others of more recent construction, date back to the time of Father Pierce. The only signs of life are the tourists, and the few Indians always to be found loitering in the vicinity. Today, Grand Portage must rely on its past to attract attention. This place, which was already old when the first white men opened up the country to which it is the gateway, will always fire the imaginations of those who revel in tales of a bygone era. The red man had from time immemorial used its ancient canoe route, which led to the Pays d'En, the upper country, as the French explorers and voyageurs were to call the whole unexplored wilderness of the boundary. Lakes destined to become part of a busy thoroughfare to empire, teeming with life and incident as long as the fur trade flourished. Situated at the mouth of the Pigeon River, where a 9-mile portage around the falls of the river gave it its name, it was the first stop on the Voyageurs' Highway. The designation given by one historian to the chain of lakes stretching from Lake Superior to the inland Lake of the Woods. From the day that some unknown savage chose the place of the Big Portage for his rendezvous, to the present when it is little more than a place name on a map, it has witnessed vibrant drama made by those who have become a part of its brilliant history. It was a stage across which passed a succession of picturesque figures, Sioux, Cree, and Chippewa Indians, dashing French explorers, humble but vivacious voyageurs in gay sashes, singing chansons from medieval France, dour Scotsmen, scions of old English houses, canny Yankees, and men whose names are known throughout the world, the Sieur de la Vérendrye, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, Peter Pond, and David Thompson. Its early history is not too well established. French explorers presumably were in this region as early as the mid-17th century. Radisson and Groseilliers supposedly explored the north shore of Lake Superior in the spring of 1660. They may have gone some distance up the Pigeon River to investigate the water route, which was soon to become a busy highway to the heart of the continent and make accessible its huge treasure, a trove of furs. For years this river was named after Groseilliers, and even today there is a river about 100 miles south of Grand Portage which bears his name in translation, Gooseberry River. Dr. Newt explains this. Careless cartographers of the 17th and 18th centuries moved the river up and down the shoreline at will on their maps, and eventually the name became attached to a stream that is exquisite in its beauty but impossible of navigation. Radisson and Groseilliers constituted the vanguard of the white man's civilization, which now began to edge its way into this country in the persons of other explorers, soldiers, fur traders, missionaries, and just plain adventurers. Written history has little to say of their exploits and achievements. Hence, credit for exploring this region must go to others who, more conscious of their duty to posterity, left records of the things they saw and the things they did. One such explorer was Pierre Gaultier de Varennes, Sieur de la Vérendrye, commandant of the French fortification on the shores of Lake Nipigon near the present Fort William, Ontario. Like most of his explorer contemporaries, he dreamed of discovering the Northwest Passage. One day, an Indian, Akshaga by name, told him a tale of a river flowing westward from Lake of the Woods, which would take him to the Pacific Ocean. He even drew a crude map for the soldier, indicating the river's approximate location. This was all that Verendrye needed to beg the civil authority in Quebec for leave to set out with an exploratory expedition. The merchants of Montreal provided the canoes, and he set out in 1731 with 50 men in his party. At Michilimackinac, he was joined by the Jesuit, Father Charles Messager. They reached Grand Portage on August 26, 1731, and to Messager must go the honor of being the first priest definitely known to have stopped off there. A mutiny which broke out among Verendrye's men was successfully quelled by the priest. The party then divided into two groups, one under the leadership of La Jemeraye, Verendrye's nephew, to push on to Rainy Lake immediately in order to establish a fort, the other to winter at Kaministigoya, an Indian village about 25 miles northwest of the present Fort William. In the spring, the journey to Lake of the Woods was resumed by Verendrye's forces, which reached Fort St. Pierre on Rainy Lake July 14, 1732. Here they were joined by a flotilla of more than 50 canoes of Indians, who escorted them to their destination. As they entered the waters of Lake of the Woods, they were enchanted by the primitive beauty of this inland sea. Father Shanahan, a historian of the Lake of the Woods country, describes it for us as it must have looked to the explorers. Before them lay the sparkling wide waters of this most lovely of all large lakes. Long, long ago, the Indians had given it its name from the thousands and thousands of islands, large and small, covered with pines, some of which grow all gnarled and grotesquely shaped from crevices in the bare rocks. It was a gem of beauty and a garden of plenty, with the game on its shores, moose and deer and partridges, and in its sparkling depths were fish in abundance. There was wild rice in its countless bays, there were ducks on its surface. The innumerable streams flowing into it were hosts to the beaver and mink and muskrat with their warm, soft furs. All these the lovely lake had to give those who would take them, and because these things were there in abundance, the Indians of the lake and the forest would battle it out from time immemorial with the foraging Indians from the prairies for the privilege of using these primeval and lush hunting and fishing and trapping grounds, so popular as a north and south highway for war. Parties, either in canoes or on foot on its banks, had been a small river flowing into the lake on its extreme southwestern end that it had been called by the Indians the River of Bloody Ground. It was pointed out to La Vérendrye as his canoes skirted the southern shore of the lake. The French then called the river Chemin de la Guerre, the Road of War, and later on the English named it the War Road River. Fort St. Charles, named after the patron saint of the governor of New France, the Marquis Charles de Beauharnois, was erected on the southern shore of the Northwest Angle Inlet, the most northerly point in the United States. Despite its pretentious name, the fort itself was merely an enclosure made with 4 rows of posts from 12 to 15 feet in height in the form of an oblong square, within which are a few rough cabins constructed of logs and clay and covered with bark. The Jesuit Messager remained at Fort St. Charles 2 years, until a complete breakdown of his health necessitated his return to France. He was succeeded by Father Jean-Pierre Aulneau, a young priest just arrived from France who had left behind him wealth and position. Aulneau's story, which only recently has been brought to light, deserves to be better known. The thrilling venture of this brave missionary makes for exciting reading, and though incidental to our main narrative, it is told with justification as a part of Minnesota's Catholic history. The sacred oils of priestly ordination were hardly dry on the young priest's hands when the Jesuit superior at Quebec assigned him as a missionary to a tribe of Indians known to the white man only from legend. The Huon-Chippewanis, they were called, those who dwell in holes. It has never been ascertained just who these Indians were, although it is generally believed that they were the Mandans. Aulneau's assignment held no terrors for him. Young and enthusiastic, he did not fear the hardships he knew he would have to face, nor did he shrink from making the sacrifices such a life demanded. not even death, or the thought of death, could shake his resolute spirit. But he did dread the loneliness of separation from priestly companionship. After receiving his assignment, he wrote to a friend, "Doubtless I shall have to undergo many hardships. They would have been more than welcome had it been. Advisable to give me another Jesuit as a companion, but I am to be sent alone among these tribes, whose language as well as whose manner of living is unknown. It was not without much pain that I brought myself to obey. May God accept the sacrifice I make of my life and of all human consolations as expiation for my sins. I shall be separated by several hundred leagues from any other priest, and in that lies the greatest hardship of all my mission. But God seems to require of me the sacrifice of even this consolation. I can refuse him nothing. May his name be blessed forever." On June 12, 1735, he took his place among the bundles of supplies in the heavily loaded canoes, and as the stalwart. Voyageurs dug their paddles into the water to begin the long, grueling journey. He waved farewell to the cheering people. Lined up on the dock, to his Jesuit confreres, who were part of that crowd, to Montreal, to all the world he had thus far known. Olno and his party stopped for a few days at Sault St. Louis and again at Mackinac Island. Not until the latter part of October did they catch their first glimpse of Lake of the Woods and Fort St. Charles on its western extremity. Olno had orders to winter at the fort and to postpone until the spring his excursion into the land of the Huon-Chippewanis. The approach of spring found him full of plans about what he would do during the summer. He wrote to his superior and put his hopes before him, concluding his letter with words that might indicate he had a presentiment of his early death. After all, what the issue of all these projects will be is known to God alone, and who can tell, perhaps instead of receiving the announcement of the realization of these plans, you may hear the news of my death. I place all in God's hands. I am disposed to offer him with a light heart the sacrifice of my life. When spring came, instead of going farther west, he accompanied the small force that Verendrye was compelled to send back to Mackinac post-haste for the provisions and gunpowder needed so badly. 3 canoes set out with 19 picked men, the priest and Jean-Baptiste Verendrye, the commandant's eldest son, who was in charge. The group set up camp the first night on an island about 20 miles from Fort St. Charles. From this point on, the lines of the story are not clear. Exactly what happened can never be definitely established, for none of them survived the massacre that took place that night. The few details which have been obtained have come from hearsay, handed down from Indian to Indian, and eventually to the French. Presumably Verendrye and his men fell victims to a party of warring Sioux who had joined them at their campfire on terms of friendship and then turned on their unsuspecting hosts at a given signal. Outnumbered and totally unprepared for such treachery, the 20 were all brutally murdered and their heads severed from their bodies. The mangled corpses were abandoned on the beach, though. The murderers took with them as trophies of their victory the heads of Olno and young Verendrye. At Fort St. Charles, the elder Verendrye had no reason to suspect his party had met with foul play until rumors reached his ears that a Sioux war party had been in the vicinity at the time. His suspicions were confirmed by the report of a trader who arrived at the fort on June 17th. This man had met none of the 3 canoes on his way west. Fearing the worst, Verendrye sent a scouting party to retrace the route taken by his son and to search the islands on the way. A few days later, the scouts returned with the tragic news of the massacre. The bereaved commandant found it impossible to dispatch canoes to Massacre Island, as it came to be known, until September. Meanwhile, friendly Indians who had discovered the horrible carnage covered the bodies with a mound of stones. They were exhumed by order of Verendrye on September 17th and reburied in the chapel of Fort St. Charles on the following day. Thus the first of many efforts put forth by the Catholic Church to evangelize the savages of the border country came to a sudden tragic halt. The 2 Jesuits who accompanied the Verendrye expeditions were the first missionaries to stop off at Grand Portage on their way westward to take up their assignments. What they actually accomplished is not known. Norton writes, No record is available of missionary work carried on at this point in the 18th century. It would seem probable, since the missionaries accompanied the Verundrai expeditions for the purpose of converting the natives of the region, that if opportunity presented itself, they would have availed themselves of the occasion to preach the gospel to the Indians. The Peace of Paris, by which France ceded Canada to England, brought to a close official French domination of the vast region north and west of the 13 colonies. 3 years earlier, the last French post in the Border Lakes region had been abandoned, but it was still some time before French. Influence was to cease entirely, as Morrison and Commager point out in their monumental work, The Growth of the American Republic. The French government continued mischievous, intrigues with its former Indian allies, and kept its finger on the pulse of colonial discontent. The best agents of France, of course, were the voyageurs, for the most part French in nationality, who continued to dominate the fur trading scene. These light-hearted adventurers were little affected by the outcome of the war. Intensely independent both in spirit and in action, they cared little who employed them as long as they could continue to participate in the carefree occupation of fur trading, which in many cases was a family tradition. When the French flag came down in North America, they transferred their allegiance to British or American masters, and once signed up, they adhered to a code of loyalty that was taken for granted among them. Grace Lee Newt, Minnesota's historian of the North Country, seems to have captured the spirit of the voyageurs in her charming description of them. The voyageurs have the distinction of being one of the few classes of men in American and Canadian history who have been unique on this continent, not only in their origin, as a class, but also in their manner of life, customs, language, and dress. They came from the Canadian French settlements along the lower St. Lawrence, where the traditions of voyaging into the Indian country had been handed down from father to son for several generations. It was considered the proper social step in those communities for young men to go into the Pays d'en Haut, the upper country, on trading expeditions in the employ of some bourgeois. To take this step, one made an engagement with an agent of the trading company, which specified the wages and other terms of the contract. In May, an expedition would set out from Montreal, several canoes organized into a brigade. The vessels of this flotilla were birch bark canoes, but not of the simple Indian style. They were about 40 feet long and had to be carried on the portages by several men, where an Indian canoe could be portaged by one man. These men were renowned for their strength, docility, and cheery dispositions. They were almost invariably courteous. They were proud of their race, their origin, their language, and their métier. The highest praise a voyageur could give of anyone else was, "That is a voyageur." 10 to 15 of them manned a Montreal canoe, 6 to 10 a North canoe. Their packs, whether of trade goods or furs, almost invariably weighed 90 pounds. 2 of these packs were the usual burden for a voyageur in making a portage. Some boasted of carrying many more, however. They loved to pull the long bow, especially about their own exploits. And though Paul Bunyan seems to be a very modern mythological hero of uncertain parentage, his prototype was every voyageur's conception of himself. Grand Portage, great inland depot of the fur trade, enjoyed its peak of prosperity from 1768, when John Askin of Mackinac cleared the area and built a fort there, to 1804. At that date, it was reasonably certain the area would become American property, despite the vague terms of the Treaty of Paris, which for all practical purposes had left unsolved the boundary dispute in the rich fur country where settlement was most important. Since the payment of customs duties to American officials would have cut down considerably the profits of the Northwest Company, chief contender for the fur monopoly of the Northwest, the scene of this lucrative business shifted from Grand Portage to a site 40 miles farther north at the mouth of the Kaministiquia River. This new trading center, which was to develop into the modern city of Fort William, was named after William McGillivray, a member of the company's board of directors. But that was not until after the turn of the century. In the meantime, Grand Portage was a booming town, enjoying the prosperity that came to it from the fur trade. Life here was exciting and colorful. Far removed from other centers of the white man's civilization, it had developed an atmosphere that was unique, Even before the Declaration of Independence was signed, more than 1,000 miles away in the heart of this northwest wilderness, there was already established a busy settlement with flourishing trade, said to have included shops, French fashions, drinking places, and even police. In 1793, the post consisted of a high stockade surrounding 16 log buildings. These provided lodgings for officers and clerks, a huge mess hall, storage for furs and supplies, and goods for barter. Beyond the enclosure were the camps of the pork eaters, as the tenderfoot canoemen were called, the wigwams of the Indians, and a canoe yard that accommodated 150 canoes. About 70 new canoes were added each year. Here foregathered hundreds of Indians, imperturbable and watchful. Here was the goal of the dashing voyageurs, naively vain and dramatically colorful, with jauntily perched plumed caps of red wool, blue capotes, and gaudy sashes, bare thighs, deerskin leggings and moccasins, and their ubiquitous pipes. 16. Grand Portage was built on an empire of furs, and no aspect of its life could escape the lusty flavor which the fur trade imparted to it. Perhaps nowhere else was this influence more strongly felt than in the social life of this trading center. It was under the complete domination of the goings and comings of the voyageurs. Whenever a boatload came in, either from Montreal with barter supplies or from the interior with their load of furs, dances and drinking parties were the order of the day. The climax of the social season invariably took place in July, when trading negotiations had been completed. A grand banquet and dance to which everybody was invited, company agents, voyageurs, and Indians, was given by the officials of the various outfits. The scene of feasting and revelry which followed must have made an unforgettable picture to the curious onlooker. Gallons of rum were drunk, and to the music of bagpipe, violin, and flute, they danced the night through with their Indian girl partners. The fiesta over, the voyageurs set off again in their canoes, loaded now with trade goods and camp supplies, and cheered by their own songs. Paddled and portaged back through the wilderness to face long months of hardship and loneliness. Any community with an economy based on a single industry must, of course, expect its fortunes to fluctuate with the ups and downs of that business. Grand Portage was no exception. While the three major fur companies made it their central headquarters, its prosperity was assured. But once they found it unprofitable to maintain depots there any longer, it would be only a matter of time before it took on the appearance of a ghost town. The Northwest Company, the biggest of the three as a result of the consolidation of many small partnerships, established itself in Grand Portage soon after 1768. It was a tremendous organization, with fur interests reaching thousands of miles from its base of operations. On its payrolls could be found the names of most of the voyageurs of the day, who paddled their canoes over the streams and lakes along the American-Canadian border in quest of pelts. No real threat to its sovereignty in the field arose until toward the end of the 18th century, when the older Hudson's Bay Company, which Radisson and Groseilliers had organized in 1670, entered the picture. The ensuing struggle is but another of the dramatic episodes which highlight the history of this untamed country. It is an action-packed story of ruthless murders and shameless mutual plundering of stockpiles. The Hudson's Bay Company, momentarily outwitted by the more effective cutthroat tactics of its competitor, was the first to admit defeat. By 1798, their posts had all but disappeared from the scene. However, the struggle was resumed with deadly earnestness a few years later, when Lord Selkirk took over the management of the company's destinies. This shrewd Scotsman had no intention of letting a fortune in furs escape from his grasp. He hired Swiss soldiers to do his fighting while his men bartered for furs. By 1816, both Fort William and Rainy Lake had fallen to his mercenaries, and he was in a position to bring about a settlement of the rivalry on his own terms. He delayed until 1821, when he achieved the coup d'etat of merging the two companies into one, both to be known as the Hudson's Bay Company. The American Fur Company, child of John Jacob Astor's fertile money-making brain, was a late arrival on the scene. Its fur posts were not erected in the territory until 1823, when Grand Portage had already entered its period of decline. A year earlier, David Thompson, head of the British Boundary Commission, passing through the town, found red clover blooming over the depressions which marked the places where formerly buildings had stood. It seems strange that some prelate, Canadian or American, or some freelancing missionary did not interest himself in establishing a mission in Grand Portage during its period of prosperity. Certainly there was enough work among the French traders and the Indians who lived near the fort to satisfy the zeal of several apostolic men. Yet, there is no evidence that a mission existed here before 1838. Once in a while, a priest might stop off at this outpost of civilization to rest before continuing his trip to some more distant point in the west. But these visits were so infrequent that when a priest did appear at Grand Portage, he found little opportunity to rest. His services would be much in demand, and the whole of his sojourn would be taken up with baptizing, hearing confessions, and blessing the graves of those who had died since the last priest was there. Father Pierre-Antoine Tabot may have been one of those priests who stopped off. He passed through this region in 1816 on his way to the Red River Valley, where he was being sent by the Bishop of Quebec, Joseph Octave Plessis, to take care of the spiritual needs of the Canadians, immigrants, and half-breeds who had settled in Lord Selkirk's colony at the confluence of the Pembina and Red Rivers. His work was seriously hampered by his indiscretion in taking sides in the bitter struggle between the fur companies, and when the Northwest Company, which he had favored, merged with the Hudson's Bay Company, he returned to Quebec. Father Joseph Crevier was in the vicinity of Fort William about the same time, and it is not unlikely that he visited Grand Portage. In 1818, the Bishop of Quebec made a second attempt to satisfy the demands of the Red River colonists for the establishment of a permanent mission among them by sending them two priests, Fathers Joseph Norbert Provencher and Sévère Joseph Nicolas Dumoulin. The route taken by them to reach their destination seems to have been the Kaministiquia River Way, which bypassed Grand Portage completely in favor of Fort William. Here, we know, they offered Holy Mass. Provencher was back in Fort William again in July 1822 on his return trip from Quebec, where he had gone for his consecration as Bishop of St. Boniface. It was on this trip that he reported he had baptized 77 children en route, 23 at Drummond Island, 41 at the Sault, 12 at Fort William, and 1 at the Pic. Although there is no evidence to support the assumption, it would not be too improbable that some of these children may have come from Grand Portage when they heard that a priest was in the vicinity. No further effort along these lines was made until 1837, when Father Baraga came there in the fall and baptized 7 persons. However, despite the fact that no missionary had settled at Grand Portage during all these years, the religious outlook there was not entirely devoid of promise. The remarkable catechetical work undertaken on his own initiative by a devout Catholic trader, the half-breed Pierre Cotte, relieves considerably what otherwise would have been a bleak picture indeed. This zealous layman had started his evangelical work among the Indians of Fond du Lac. A copy of one of Baraga's Indian prayer books fell into his hands. And thumbing through the little manual, he had the thought that perhaps he could in some small measure prepare the Indians for the day when a priest should come among them and baptize them in the Catholic faith. What he accomplished is a matter of record. Even the Protestant missionaries in the field complained about the effectiveness of his work. He not only taught the Indians how to pray and to sing the traditional church hymns which Baraga had translated into their own language, but even made some effort to instruct them in the more elementary truths of the Christian religion. When Baraga visited Fond du Lac in 1835, he was amazed to find a group of Indians who were sufficiently instructed to warrant baptism without any further indoctrination on his part. The catechumens awaited him in the fur trader's house, and when he entered, they all fell on their knees and asked him for a blessing. Pierre Cotte did his work well, and the Catholic missions of Fond du Lac and Grand Portage had reason to be grateful to him. He had no formal obligation to undertake this great responsibility, yet, if he had not been equal to the situation, many of the savages who owed their conversion to his zeal might have joined one or another of the Protestant denominations. The Reverend Edmund F. Ely, who was sponsored by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, referred to him as the pillar of Catholicism, and noted in his journal that if Kot could be removed from the scene, the prospects for his own mission would be much improved. It is evident from the entries in this journal that the traitor was quite a thorn in the minister's side. Kot showed Ely every respect as a man, but had no hesitancy whatsoever in putting him in his place when he attempted to interfere with the work of catechizing. The traitor even permitted Ely to be present at the makeshift Catholic services he conducted in his home, but advised him to leave whenever he felt the urge to lead in the prayers. Ely's diary reads, "This evening, Mons Kot requested me to desist praying in their meeting and after reading. For himself, he said my prayers were very good, but I did not make the cross, did not love it, and the Catholic Indians would not stay in the room when I prayed. They did not wish to learn any other prayers. He wished all the exercises might be as usual, except that when it was time for my accustomed prayer, that I would retire and offer it somewhere else. He reminded me that all the children were Catholic children and did not wish I should teach them. Otherwise, as also the praying Indians did not wish me to mention the subject to them." Kot's opposition to the Protestant missionary was not entirely due to the fact that the two men were of different religious persuasions. Some of the Indians had wrongly concluded that Ely was a Catholic when they noticed the cordiality with which the traitor had received him into his house. Ely seems to have capitalized this misconception by attempting to proselytize some of Kot's catechumens, thereby incurring the latter's displeasure. Ely's own words serve to bear this out. Under date of May 22, 1835, he wrote in his journal, "I brought a letter and a packet of crosses from La Pointe from the Cath, priest at Sault-Timons, code by which he learns that the priest intends visiting this place in summer. The Indians are daily asking me if it is so, and I express my ignorance and refer them to M. Cote. I presume that many of them think that I am of the same faith of the Catholics. I have never attempted to tell them the contrary." 2 years before Father Pierre's arrived in Grand Portage to establish his mission, Cotte and his wife moved their trading post there. The place, which had once teemed with activity, was now almost deserted. Only a few French families and a scattering of Indians still made their homes there. The emphasis had shifted to fishing, especially after 1833, when the charter of the American Fur Company lapsed. A reorganization of the company under its new president, Ramsey Crooks, resulted in the launching of a new policy which aimed at substituting fish for furs as a source of income. The waters of Lake Superior abounded in whitefish and trout, both of which were sought as delicacies by the gourmets of the East. After considerable scouting by agents of the company for a suitable fishing station, Grand Portage was agreed upon because, being on the north shore, the lake is rarely agitated by the prevailing winds, and the operations of the fishermen are seldom interrupted there, while the whole southern coast is constantly exposed to the heavy winds from west to north, and the sea is too rough to allow the people to visit their nets sometimes for several days at a time. The management of this fishery was given to Cotte under the terms of a contract which extended from 1836 to 1840, inclusively, and gave him a commission of 5% on the total annual catch. A whole new industry now grew up at Grand Portage, and many Indians returned to their former homes to seek employment as fishermen. The natives of the Great Lakes region excelled in this profession, and the fishing venture of the American Fur Company afforded them an opportunity to be gainfully employed. A visitor to this country in the 1830s, the Englishwoman Anna Jameson recorded in her Winter Studies and Summer Rambles, published in 1839, her impressions of the Indian skill in fishing. "I used to admire the fishermen on the Arno and those on the Laguna, and above all, the Neapolitan fishermen, hauling in their nets or diving like ducks, but I never saw anything like these Indians. The manner in which they keep their position upon a footing of a few inches is to me as incomprehensible as the beauty of their forms and attitudes, swayed by every movement and turn of their dancing, fragile barks, is admirable." During his tenure, Cotte employed dozens of Indians to keep the fish market of the East supplied. He had 2 coopers who did nothing else but build barrels in which the fish were shipped. Others searched the surrounding woods for suitable trees to make the barrel staves or hook poles on which some of the catch was hung in the winter for quick freezing. Most of the fish, however, was salted. He paid the coopers $200 a year. He had 9 in his employ in 1839, and the fishermen $100 to $150 a year. Some of the Indians worked on their own, and to these he gave salt, nets, and barrels, besides paying them $3 for each barrel of fish they turned in. That it was no small venture is amply borne out by the following excerpt taken from Dr. Newt's interesting study of the history and legend of Lake Superior. 300 to 500 barrels of fish were the usual result of a year's activities at Grand Portage. Whitefish and trout formed the bulk of the season's catch. Wood for staves and hook poles was cut out during the winter, but a dozen men could hardly be kept busy for 8 months getting materials for 500 barrels. Trout did not begin to run in toward shore to their spawning grounds until August 20 or thereabout. For 2 months, all hands were busy setting nets, taking them up, cleaning and packing the fish in salt, and transporting the barrels to the storehouses. Then the whitefish appeared and stayed into November. The remainder of the year the company supported men who had little to do except to make nets or to cut and haul a small amount of wood. Of course, the fishing industry at Grand Portage, with its annual catch of about 500 barrels, was small in comparison with what the other fishing stations maintained by the American Fur Company shipped. For example, the ordinary yield for 1 year at Isle Royale was about 2,000 barrels and salt stay. Marie, La Pointe, and Fond du Lac could boast of equally impressive figures. But the point to be emphasized is that, small as the catch was by comparison, it succeeded in rejuvenating Grand Portage and putting it on the map again. This explains, too, why Braga had decided to send Father Pierce to open the newest of the Lake Superior missions there. When he arrived on July 13, 1838, he was not prepared for the enthusiastic welcome he received from the Indians as his canoe pulled up to the landing. He had expected this assignment to be no different from any of his previous ones, where he had had to do all the work. But a different situation prevailed here. Everything was in readiness for his arrival. He even found a chapel of cedar bark and deerskin, which he dedicated to divine worship on July 25 under the patronage of St. Peter, and, incredible as it may seem, a number of Indians were ready for the immediate reception of baptism. Pierre Cotte had found time, among his manifold other duties, to carry on the catechetical work he had commenced at Fond du Lac. The Indians whom Cotte had not had the opportunity of reaching were nonetheless well disposed toward the Christian religion. They had been deeply impressed by the power of prayer when one of their number, who was gravely ill, had turned to the God of the Christians and promised to embrace the Catholic faith if he were cured. The man was completely restored to health in such a short time that it seemed miraculous. Only a few days before he had been given up as doomed by the medicine man, who had already begun to beat the drum over his head to expel the soul. True to his promise, he took instructions and was the first to receive baptism from Father Pierce. Others followed his example, so that before long Grand Portage was almost completely Catholic. The missionary writes, "This mission, so singularly blessed by God and so quickly established, gave me exceeding great joy. The exceptional zeal of the good Indians spurred me on to give catechetical instructions daily to large and small, also directions in prayer, singing, reading, and writing." 3. Although his stay at Grand Portage was of very short duration, Father Pierce did some of the best work of his entire missionary career at this post. Apart from the natural beauty of the region, he found the place ideally suited for a mission. Nature had endowed it with enough resources to enable the Indian to attain some measure of economic stability. Fishing provided a means of livelihood a good part of the year. The soil was well suited for farming, and Pierce soon initiated his flock into the mysteries of gardening and fruit culture. His efforts to civilize the natives and make them economically independent brought gratifying results. He discussed this in one of his letters. "Since, however, I wish to train those poor savages to become not only good Christians, but also industrious laborers and civilized men, I also led them from temporal misery to befitting prosperity. At the time of my arrival, those inhabitants of the forest were in such misery and suffered from famine to such an extent that I was moved to tears of compassion. The women, although poor, were decently dressed, while the men, in addition to a loin apron, were clothed in an old, coarse, shabby blanket. Almost all the children were naked. Only the girls wore a rabbit pelt for a partial covering. I, therefore, bought new dresses for all the children and also supplied the men with shirts and footgear. I, moreover, purchased for them fishing nets and procured a good hose and all other necessary garden and field tools. Having caught, to their exuberant joy, a great many fish that enabled them to satiate themselves, the Indians began to work energetically, so that under my guidance and practical instruction, they cleared entirely the soil of 10 beautiful islands, together with their soil on Pigeon River, and prepared them for cultivation. The lands were planted with potatoes and sown with various European garden seeds. One good crop of early garden produce, never seen before, raised such ecstatic joy in the Redskins that in the following year they doubled their industry by expanding their fields. As a result of their potato crop, they sold 1,000 bushels for $1,000 to the white miners. This enabled them to procure warm clothing and some of the comforts of life. Soon after his arrival, Father Pierce opened a small elementary school in conjunction with his mission. This was a regular procedure for him wherever he went. It was much like any other schoolhouse of the period. The 3 R's formed the backbone of the curriculum, and Father Baraga's Chippewa prayer book was the text from which the pupils learned to read, pray, and sing. His pupils were an odd assortment of French and Indians, adults as well as children, the only prerequisite for enrollment being that they be under 50 years of age. From the report which he submitted to Daniel P. Bushnell, the Indian Office sub-agent resident at La Pointe, the school seems to have been well patronized. He had a total enrollment of 75 pupils, of which 58 were Indians and 17 French. 31 of these were adults. To his report he added the following remarks. The Indians of this place are a part of the Chippewa tribe, but they are distinguished from others of the same tribe by their desire for civilization and education. The climate also admits the culture of a few vegetables which had never been introduced among them before my arrival. The number of Indians is not so great at present as formerly. The savages, from their great desire of civilization and education, deserve to have their request granted and their manners changed, and to be ranked among civilized people, and they also serve as an example to other tribes of this territory. The undersigned was, by a special invitation of the Indians of Grand Portage, requested to establish a Catholic mission among them, which he thought proper to do, and has since organized a school for the benefit of these poor, ignorant savages. He hopes also, by the assistance of the government of the United States, to continue his efforts for the temporal and spiritual welfare of the Indians. Evidently, Bushnell was favorably impressed by the report, for he forwarded it to Washington with his endorsement. I believe Mr. Pierce's school is much entitled to the bounty of the government as any of these establishments. 35. Unfortunately, not all of Pierce's relations with the field agents of the Indian Office were equally pleasant. Frequently, the men employed by the government to supervise the allocation of its Indian funds were not all that one would expect such persons to be. Most of them were Protestants, the majority of whom found it difficult to overcome their natural prejudice against the Catholic Church. The missionaries in the field were the ones who felt the full impact of this bias when their bids for federal money to carry on the work of educating the Indians were either rejected or cut down to a minimum. It is hard to exonerate some of these men of all blame for the way they discharged their duties. Perhaps their animosity to the Roman communion was so intense that it warped their sense of justice and decency. But this only lessens their culpability, it does not remove it. Even while we admit that some of the Catholic missionaries, Father Pierce among them, had no use for their Protestant contemporaries in the field, there were reasons why such a situation developed. Many times over, the missionaries were the victims of anti-Catholic discrimination in the distribution of government monies just because some petty local official vetoed their application. Henry R. Schoolcraft, who was in charge of the Indian Office Superintendency at Detroit, was one of these agents. His prejudice against the Catholic Church and its missionary activities among the Indians was common knowledge. Yet no historian has noted this fact in the volumes which have been written of his exploits as an explorer and an employee of the government's Indian service. From 1822 until 1841, he supervised the work which was conducted by the various church groups among the Indians of the Great Lakes region and beyond. In his travels, he must have had an opportunity of studying at first hand what each denomination was doing for the red man. Yet he has scant praise for the achievements of Catholic missionaries. He writes disparagingly of their labors while at the same time giving unstinted praise to his co-religionists. One wonders how this man could in conscience send to Washington a report such as the following, which conflicts with all the facts in the case. I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your letter of the 16th instant, respecting the application of the school and mission funds therein referred to, and herewith forward you additional reports from teachers and missionaries received in answer to the circular, since the date of my letter transmitting Mr. Slater's report and school register. These reports have come in by the spring mails and evince a ready disposition to furnish the data required. They afford a satisfactory view of the schools under the charge of the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian societies. No reports have been received from the Catholic Church, although the circular was punctually forwarded to all, without distinction on the same day, namely, the 7th of November last. Should any reports from that church come in, they will be immediately forwarded. I have also perused the letter of Bishop Rize of the April 20th, 1837, on this subject, a copy of which was transmitted to me by the department without, however, coming to a different conclusion than that heretofore indicated as to the proportion of its claims on this fund. The bishop evidently wrote his letter in haste at New York, perhaps with no data at hand to refer to, and probably with an imprecise knowledge of the geographical features of the country occupied by the Indian tribe, who are parties to the treaty. This will account for his including mission stations in Michigan and Wisconsin widely out of the district, together with a station among the Menominees who have no claims on the fund. The very erroneous impression conveyed of the population of l'Abercrochie's vicinity, the subdivision of several missions or mission to state whether the churches, which are all embraced under the term of missions, are among the white, Canadian, or Indian population, whether they have schools for the education of children, and if so, what number of each class are taught, what portion of the year the schools are open, the branches of instruction, number of teachers, expenses, and other particulars named in the circular of the department, without which it is impossible for the department to judge of the claims of this church to a superior money allowance. It is evident from these errors and omissions in data that Bishop Rize addressed the department in haste, that his object was chiefly to remind it in general terms of his claims, and that he did not anticipate the transmission of his letter to this office. I therefore omit a further scrutiny of its contents, although he himself furnishes a justification for criticism by the allegation of injustices and inequality in the distribution of the Mission Fund of 1836. I shall not decline, however, putting it to this test if need be. In the meantime, I feel it proper, as an officer of the department exercising an independent responsibility, to say that I do not think the efforts of the Catholic Church in this superintendency in relation to the education and moral improvement of Indian children equally successful and efficacious with those of the Protestant denominations in the same field of labor. It may here be added, with respect to my former suggestion of including the Episcopal Church in the annual distribution of the fund, that no data are before me in the shape of reports. A minister of that denomination has labored a part of the time at Michilimackinac, and a very competent teacher is now located there. And I have no doubt that any amount awarded to that branch of the Protestant Church would be faithfully and efficiently applied. The object of setting apart so considerable a sum for education and mission purposes in the Treaty of the March 28, 1836, was to afford the means of instruction and improvement freely to the children of the tribes, and thus to rescue them from ignorance and superstition. And it appears to me that, in the annual distribution of it, the most enlarged principles should be adopted. I beg leave to add to this letter a list of the respective heads of the churches in Michigan, to whom I think it would be proper to transmit any sums which the department may award. The letter needs no comment. It is self-explanatory. Schoolcraft could not have been so ignorant of the state of affairs in the Protestant missions under his jurisdiction as not to know that some of them were undeserving of government assistance. Neither the Baptists at Sault Ste. Marie nor the Presbyterians at Grand Traverse had capable or high-minded men in charge of these missions, and these were the men with whom Pierce came in contact and whose activities he observed at close range. Their work, however, received unqualified endorsement from Schoolcraft, while the labors of Catholic missionaries, which time has proven to have been far more successful than any of the Protestant endeavors, were compelled to suffer from a lack of funds rightly due them. Father Tennelly of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions has summed up the case well. Speaking of Pierce's critical attitude toward the Protestant missionary effort, he concludes, "His generalizations are not unpardonable, even though not wholly warranted. In fact, the results of most of its missions in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota were a disappointment to the American Board. Though the work in these new fields, says its official historian, was bravely begun, it became more and more clear that little was being accomplished. It was not simply that there were few converts. The fact was that the roving habits of the Indian, the interference of hostile white men, the growing prejudice of a government which broke its treaties so lightly, together with the repeated removals of the tribes as the country expanded, made constructive work almost impossible. The Methodists in 1852, after almost 20 years of effort, claimed only 107 Indian members in their 5 northern Chippewa missions. Failure was due, to a great extent, to a wrong policy and to faulty methods. Protestant missionary policy was largely based upon the then current theory that the Indian must be civilized before he could be Christianized. It ignored the important fact that the vital forces of civilization are spiritual and religious. The power of the printed page, in the case of the Presbyterian and Congregationalist, or that of the Ossika, the means they relied upon, along with the supposedly elevating influence of American dress, habits, language, and occupations. Father Pierce's brief excursion into Minnesota seems to have been very beneficial for him. He experienced an uplift of his spirits which had fallen extremely low while he was at Sault Ste. Marie. Once again, he felt all the zest for missionary life that he had when he first came to America. To be sure, he was not spared any of the problems that he had to contend with elsewhere, nor was his financial condition eased, but the exceptional character of the Indians at Grand Portage served to make that burden lighter. It was his first contact with the Chippewas, and he was immediately won over by them. They impressed him as being superior to the Ottawas in talent, ability to learn, and zeal in the worship of God. If the decision had been his own to make, he would have had no hesitation in choosing to remain among them the rest of his life. He wrote as follows to a friend in Carniola. Now I have established myself at Grand Portage, where, to my own great consolation, the fine mission congregation I founded among newly converted pagans has developed nicely. I am surrounded by very good Christians entirely after my own heart, who are devoted to me with heart and soul. The pattern of daily life at Grand Portage was much the same as that which Pierce introduced on his other missions. Every morning after sunrise, the signal for morning prayer is given with a large shell or a small bell. All prayers and daily devotions open and close with a beautiful hymn of which the Indians are extraordinarily fond. After morning prayer, I read Holy Mass while the choir with beautiful hymns raise the heart to God, or the leader reads from the book to his people during the holy sacrifice of the Mass, alternating the reading with the recital of the Rosary. After Mass, I read a selection from the Gospel in the Indian language and explained by means of an interpretation in the manner of a homily. After breakfast until time for the evening repast, I usually maintain a school for old and young, and teach them the necessary prayers and hymns. After sunset, the signal is given for night prayer, which opens and closes again with a hymn. After this, I read a few words from the Catechism and explain it as comprehensively as possible. At the close, I tell them a story of one of the saints from the legends. On Saturday afternoons and also on Sunday morning until 10 o'clock, the hour for Mass, I usually hear confessions. Every Sunday and holiday, High Mass with a sermon is celebrated with solemnity. the priest having previously sprinkled the people with holy water during the singing of the Asperges Domine, which psalm is taken up and continued by the choir in the Indian language. During the High Mass, all those versed in and capable of reading sing from the book and respond in Latin. After the communion of the priest, the communicants approach the altar to receive Holy Communion, while the choir intones a devotional hymn in honor of the Blessed Sacrament, and the leader prays aloud the prayers in preparation for communion and in thanksgiving after communion. Those who are to receive Holy Communion for the first time always approach the altar with a lighted candle in the hand and dressed neatly. Holy Communion is never distributed to the Indians, with the exception of the sick, except at the communion of the Mass. Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock, Vespers are sung with 5 psalms in the Indian language, and the Sunday oration in the Latin, and are completed with the Benedicamus Domino. Christian doctrine follows this. After all this has taken place, the sacrament of baptism is solemnly conferred on the catechumens if they are sufficiently prepared. I always open such solemnities with a short instruction from the rich material content of the function, and the choir intones a soul-elevating hymn in which the convert takes leave of heathenism and abjures all pagan vices in order to serve God his Creator. The close includes, again, an address to the newly baptized or to the heathens, present with a prayer of thanks to God for the graces of the day. During his sojourn at Grand Portage, from July 13th, 1838 to May 11th, 1839, he baptized 64 persons. His records also show that he had a mission at Fort William, a day's journey from Grand Portage, where he baptized a number of persons during the same period. The Indians of this place were very similar in disposition to those he met at his central mission. Of them he writes, "After several visits, with God's help, I made good Christians of them, and derived much spiritual consolation from their conversion. For in religious zeal they almost equaled their brethren and relatives of Grand Portage." He also took care of missions at Isle Royale, an island about 14 miles out in Lake Superior and approximately midway between Grand Portage and Fort William, and at the Peace calls it Pic, which is about 150 miles from Grand Portage, on the north shore. In the summer of 1839, he made an extensive missionary journey which took in missions all along the northern shore of, revisited his flocks at Fort William, the Pic, Michipicoten, and Oquanaquissinong, and even made a side trip in order to see his first parishioners at La Croix. Here his correspondence differs from the later account to be found in his book, The Indians of North America. In the former, he notes that the inhabitants of Sault Ste. Marie had been without a priest for a year, and that he intended to stay with them at least temporarily, even though they were not deserving of this blessing. The story is slightly different in another letter, where he states that he had received a letter at the Sault from the Vicar General of the Detroit Diocese telling him to take charge of Arbre Croche, which had been left vacant by the departure of Father Sainderl for a German parish in Rochester. In his book, the account becomes even more confusing. In the beginning of October 1839, I received an urgent letter from my Right Reverend Bishop at Detroit, in which I was instructed to leave all my missions on Lake Superior, and to repair at once to Arbre Croche in the state of Michigan, and to take care of the Ottawa Indians. Whatever the actual sequence of events, Father Pierce was compelled by virtue of his bishop's orders to close for the time being his missionary activities on the North Shore. He took a tearful leave of his Chippewa flock on October 14, 1839, promising that he would not abandon them but would send another priest to take his place. The trip to Arbre Croche, which was made in a boat 24 feet long and 4 feet wide, took 51 days, during which Pierce and his 2 Indian companions had to struggle day and night with wind and cold, with rain and storms, with snow and ice, out in the open against the adverse elements. 49. Once a storm almost dashed the boat and its occupants against the rocks along the coast, and only providentially were they guided into a quiet bay where they were able to dry their clothes and obtain some rest. They finally reached Arbre Croche on the afternoon of December 3, 1839. It was the feast day of St. Francis Xavier.